Many, many kids across this country dream of playing in the National Hockey League someday. A tiny, tiny percentage make it. But Mike Marson from Scarborough, Ontario, did. And when he did, he was just the second black player in NHL history ever to get to the big stage. He played almost 200 games in the league, and he joins us now to reflect on what it took to get there and the barriers he faced throughout his career. Mike, it's a great pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure, Steve.
I saw you play. I watched you play. And you had the misfortune of not playing on the Washington Capitals of Alex Ovechkin.
Yes.
But the Washington Capitals, who I think were the worst team of all time at that time.
Yes, we were. We'd only won 7 games the first year.
Oof, 7 out of 80 or something?
7 out of 80,
Oof,
and it was
gosh.
just a nightmare going on the road. Just a nightmare.
Well, let's go back and tell your story. You're from Scarborough. What was
Yes.
it like growing up there?
Scarborough then was very rural. A lot of country. We had cornfields just north. I'm from Warden and Lawrence area. And one of my neighbors just up the street was, of course, Tim Horton.
Ah.
We were at 1292, and he was at 1378, if I remember correctly.
Did you ever knock on his door?
Oh, we used to go play ball hockey around the corner and then knock on his door, and, he'd wake up and come to the door, and he'd fill the doorway. He was just a massive guy. And sign our autographs and,
Ever join in for a game of road hockey?
No.
You never did that?
No.
Okay.
Well, in those days, most of the travel by professional athletes was done on the train.
Right.
So these guys are coming in, they're exhausted.
Exactly.
That's all they can do to get home and be with family.
How did you fall in love with hockey?
Most of my classmates were involved with hockey. And so we would go and we'd skate in different people's backyards. Some of the fathers then were out there with the bucket of water or the hose or whatnot. And then we would go, once it got developed in the schoolyard, we would go over and play in the schoolyard, same idea. And, you start competing, every sport that you are competing in, you try to bring it to a certain competitive level. And for me, I guess I was lucky that, hockey seemed to be something that I was directed into.
At what age do you start to think, I just might be good enough to make a career out of this?
Well, I remember grade 9 thinking to myself that if I could stay in the 3%, the other guys around the league, then it was the GTHL, if I could stay in that 3%, then that was the crew that was going to go in the draft for the first 2 rounds to junior. And I don't know if you remember, Steve, but we had a team, a WHA team that was here, the Toros.
Of course.
And
Frank Mahovlich played for them
Frank
for a while.
Mahovlich and Wayne Dillon, who was a contemporary of mine at the time. He went out and he played for them. And it was really interesting that we were trying to figure out how to turn pro earlier, so that we could, be involved in competing at that higher level. But for most of us that turned junior or pro too early, it was too much. It was like putting a 6-year-old in a Ferrari.
You did get drafted, though, and ended up going to play your junior up in Sudbury.
I did.
And what was that like?
Well, it was interesting because the year before I had gone to Chatham to play for the Chatham Maroons. And it was the old Outlaw League, they called it. And so I had a chance to, at 16, compete with guys that were in their early 20s. Which was interesting, again, because they kind of showed me the ropes. Guys like Kenny Houston, who wound up playing with Atlanta eventually. Randy McGregor also was there. And then, pardon me, when I got drafted by Sudbury, I had already kind of gone through the orientation of what it's like to play hockey at that level.
Now, in this day and age, where we're supposed to be a little smarter and a little more multicultural and a little more, a bit of enhanced sensitivity about these things, we still see examples of stupid racism at games.
Of course.
So I want to ask you, about 40 years ago, playing in Sudbury, Ontario, did you run into any of that?
Sudbury wasn't too bad. Most of the junior teams in the Ontario circuit were pretty good. You'd have the odd thing that would happen, the odd person would say something. But by and large, people at that time they had a different perspective than folks that were in the U.S. at the time, because they had all the burnings of the cities and with the race riots and the police turning hoses on, people that were protesting. So before 20 years was up, I was turning pro into that hot pool of all kinds of stuff was taking place.
You want to see yourself?
It was.
Look at the monitor up there. Go ahead, have a look at the monitor. Let's bring that up, Sheldon.
I probably have hair.
Look at you. What a strapping youngster you are. That's your first year. You're drafted into the 2nd round, 19th overall by the Washington Capitals.
Yes.
That is as these things go, that's a very high draft pick. Were you surprised to have gone that high?
I was hoping to go as a first rounder. But the ego of athletes, you always figure you're better than you perhaps are. And
well, I don't know. You had a pretty great junior career.
I had it was
You were
okay.
captain of the Wolves.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember now. You had
All-star.
You had something like, I'm thinking something like 85 points in 60 games?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you had a good career.
I did okay, but the thing was that, again, if you look at it from a historical perspective, here's this kid who came up 42 years ago into this social setup where all kinds of crazy stuff is going on just because he happens to have more pigmentation in his skin. Not only does that play out on the rink and with the fans, pardon me, but it also plays out with the hate mail that I used to get, where somebody would cut out of a magazine, a sentence, stick it to the piece of paper, wrap it up, put a stamp on it, and send it to my house or send it to the Capitol Center.
Saying what?
Something derogatory. Definitely there were bombs dropped in the letter, and that they were looking to harm me in some way, shape, or form.
Did you believe the threats?
Of course. I mean, at first you think, oh, this is just somebody playing around. But then as time went on, I remember bringing it to the attention of, my authorities at the Capitol Center and saying, what do you think?
Now, we should remember that. I mean, this is Washington, D.C.
Yes.
It's a southern city.
It's below the Mason-Dixie line.
It sure is. And did you run? Now, when you played for the Capitals in Washington,
yes,
on the worst team ever at that time in the history of the NHL,
yes,
did you run into lots of racism in the city?
Well, we were lucky as players because the captain of the state troopers was our security representative. So if you had any situation that required immediate assistance, you would have the officer call the commander, and he would then decide what it was they were going to do and solve it right then and there. So we had that. That was a great benefit. Many times, you're in a small situation, or you're shopping, and there's somebody says something, and you're a young guy, black guy with an afro like Bobby Seale had, and you're driving a Jaguar, and push comes to shove. And in those days, you're feisty. 18, 19, 20, you want to rock and roll.
Any difficulty being accepted by your teammates?
Not really, no. Every team that's of a professional nature, there's always some kind of rift or some different perspective. One guy's making more money than another guy, so there's going to be a competitive way of thinking. Another guy is, when I was 19, I didn't get treated like that, or you're on the first line, now I'm on the third line. Within the context of a team, there's a lot of stuff going on a regular basis.
Mike, I've always wanted to ask you this. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947, but then a few months later, Larry Doby comes along. So it's only a few months between the first and the second. In the National Hockey League, Willie O'Ree, of course, breaks the color barrier in the 1950s with the Boston Bruins, but then you don't come along as the second black player in NHL history for another 16 years. Why do you think that was?
First of all, there's a lot involved as far as talent, as far as your abilities to handle situations. You have to be able to multitask. You got to be able to handle the rough stuff. You got to be able to put the biscuit in the basket, as they say. And you have to be able to, be capable of going, forward and working with the aggressive parts of things. If the gloves come off, you have to handle that. It takes someone very different and unique to be able to hear negativity on a regular basis and not let it affect them.
How did it not affect you?
Oh, you would have a moment where you would maybe, when you were by yourself, you'd have a tear. That sort of thing would go on. You're a young man, and the pressure of trying to perform at your best. But for a lot of people, that would just make them quit. At that stage, they'd say, well, I don't want to do this anymore. That's all there is to it.
Why didn't you?
I don't know. I was hungry for something. I remember back in the day with my Uncle Romeo and my dad sitting watching hockey, and they would throw the pillows at the television when the Leafs were playing if a goal was scored. And I remember the first time we all watched Willie O'Ree. And I said to my Uncle Rome and my dad, I want to do that. I want to be a hockey player. So it meant whatever I had to sacrifice, that's what I had to do in order to get there.
And it didn't matter what they did to you in the NHL? Because I imagine some guys, there must have been some fights that you had. I mean, you were in junior hockey 150 minutes a year in the penalty box, right? You could fight.
There were situations, but, people ask me that question all the time. I'm out with friends or whatever. The thing is, it was 40 some odd years ago. And my feeling is that everybody evolves. So who you were at 21 or 22 or 25, I have to think that they've become enlightened, that they see life a little different now that they're 60 whatever or 70. Some would be 70. And so I don't see the point in bringing that up in a negative way to make a guy to point a finger and say, you know, you called me whatever, blah, blah, blah. You know, I don't see the point.
I hear what you're saying, but you know what, Mike? I mean, I remember back then. I mean, I've been going to hockey games since the mid-1960s.
Right.
And, you know, French-Canadian players were on the receiving end of racism.
That's right, yeah.
So you got to think the only black kid in the league is going to face his fair share of it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what, again, I guess I wonder how you manage to sort of put that in its place and still play the game.
You got to be, there's a kind of place you have to go to in your mind where you refuse to be beaten. You refuse to give up. And you just do the best with what you got that day. Sometimes you're going to be plus, sometimes you're going to be minus. But you just keep going. Every time you get knocked down, you get back up on your feet and you roll. And that's something that I think, I don't know if that came from the old days of watching John Wayne and the cowboy, the Western movies, but it's that same kind of thinking. You know, you can't just lay there because no one's coming to save you. Get up and limp to wherever you have to go to.
Did you recall, though, that when you played, I mean, you were up in NHL and then down to the AHL and up and back and up, I mean, 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do have to ask, do you think, did racism have anything to do with that?
Well, I don't, you have to understand that, and I know you're a sportsman, Steve, but professional hockey is like a sacred sorority. And even if a guy does you wrong on the rink, in private life, you don't carry that. Because the competitive nature has to be such that he has to do sometimes things that would be outside of his own mode of conduct. So again, I don't see the point in going back in time. I'm a bigger man than what I suffered through, if that is an answer that helps you with that. But
so,
sure, there were all kinds of things that went on.
So part of, if I'm reading between the lines, part of all of what you went through has made you who you are today.
Yes.
And you like who you are today.
I like who I am today.
So it's all part of it?
It's all part of it. And I'm totally at peace, and I would like to do a book. You know, I was involved with Kwame Mason and his documentary that he did that won praises in Calgary, and it's been seen by the hierarchy of the National Hockey League. It showed here twice, Mike Wilson's place, and then down at the Rainbow Theatre.
Is that Soul on Ice?
Soul on Ice, past, present, and future.
Should we show a clip of that?
Sure, that'd be
great. We got
great.
something standing by. This is PK Subban's parents.
Yes.
Talking about encouraging kids to aim high. Roll the clip, please.
In life, it's important to have a big dream. And it's like I say, PK, Malcolm, and Jordan, no one placed them on top of the hockey mountain. They had to work hard to get there. They had to persevere to get there. There were times when we thought that it wasn't going to happen, but we never gave up. And that's the story. That's what parents need to know. That's what young people need to know, that whatever they set their mind to, they can achieve.
Mike, when you see PK Subban making, I don't know, what does he make? Does he make $10 million a year? Something like that?
Something like that.
Something like that?
He gave away $10 million.
He did, yes he did. When you see him, you know, one of the most popular players in the NHL today, what do you think?
I feel proud. You know, I feel like as a trailblazer, I feel like there was a forest that stood before me and I started chopping as far as I could go, made it as far as I could, and then the next group comes in and they don't have to chop quite as far and things are a little bit easier for them.
When you watch, do you watch games on TV now?
Sure, I do.
You follow the NHL?
I have a look at it, you know.
Who's your team?
Don't really have a team.
You live in Toronto, Mike.
Well, I've always been a Maple Leaf fan, but you know, you just have a look at it.
When you're watching, it's still pretty rare to see a black face on the ice nowadays.
True.
And when you do you ever think these are black guys playing a white man's game?
No.
You don't think that?
No. I consider myself a Canadian first, because when I grew up, we came up under the original Trudeau regime, where the multiculturalism was played out, and you know, you had friends from every walk of life and every nationality. And I remember when you went home for lunch, you could smell the different foods being cooked. So-and-so's mom was making spaghetti and meatballs. So somebody else was making beans and wieners, you know, and so forth, lasagna and, you know, soul food. And so, you know, it was just different. It was just a different setup totally.
Mike, it's great to have you here at TVO. Thanks so much.
Steve, my pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.